May 28, 1918 dawned cold and gray over the French countryside, and in the tiny village of Cantigny, nestled among the rolling wheat fields of Picardy, the locals had no idea their quiet hamlet would soon become the proving ground for an untested army from across the Atlantic. For nearly 4 years, Europe had bled itself white in the Great War, and the arrival of American forces, fresh-faced, eager, but utterly unproven in modern combat, was met with skepticism by battle-hardened French and British commanders who had watched entire generations disappear into the muddy hell of trench warfare. The American Expeditionary Forces, under the command of General John Joseph Pershing, had been arriving in France since the summer of 1917. But by spring of the following year, they had yet to engage in a significant offensive operation of their own. The Allied commanders, desperate for manpower after the catastrophic losses of previous years, pressed Pershing to allow American units to be integrated into French and British divisions as replacements. Pershing refused. He understood something crucial. If America was to have a voice at the peace table, its army needed to prove itself as an independent fighting force. The soldiers of the 1st Division, nicknamed the Big Red One for the distinctive red numeral on their shoulder patches, would be the ones to carry that burden. Among the ranks of the 28th Infantry Regiment were men from every corner of the United States. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Pittsburgh, clerks from New York City. They had trained together, sailed together across the submarine-infested Atlantic, and now huddled together in muddy trenches carved into French soil, waiting for orders that would send them into battle. Lieutenant George Butler Redwood, a 24-year-old officer from Virginia, wrote in his diary that the men were nervous as cats, but determined to show the world what Americans are made of. The weight of national pride rested heavily on their shoulders. The German army had made significant gains in the spring of 1918, pushing Allied forces back in a series of devastating offensives that brought them within striking distance of Paris. The captured village of Cantigny sat on a strategic ridge that allowed German artillery, observers to direct fire on Allied positions for miles around. French commanders identified the position as a critical objective, but they had neither the men nor the morale to launch another assault after years of grinding attrition. When the proposal came to give the American 1st Division its first real test, Pershing saw his opportunity. He would prove that American soldiers could not only fight but win in modern warfare. Colonel Hanson, Edward Ely, commanding the 28th Infantry Regiment, was a hard-bitten professional soldier who had served in the Philippines and on the Mexican border, according to historical accounts preserved in the 1st Division Museum archives. He gathered his officers and made his expectations clear. "Gentlemen, we have been given the honor of being the first American unit to take and hold enemy territory in this war. We will not fail. We will not retreat. If we go forward together, and we stay forward." The strategic importance of Cantigny extended far beyond its size, a collection of perhaps 24 stone buildings clustered around a small church with a damaged steeple that the Germans used as an observation post. Major Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, and serving as a battalion commander in the 26th Infantry Regiment attached to the operation, understood that military success here would reverberate across both sides of the Atlantic. In a letter to his wife Eleanor that would later be published in Joseph Buckland Bishop's biography of the Roosevelt family, he wrote, "This is our moment to show that American democracy can produce soldiers equal to any in the world. The eyes of 2 continents are upon us." Planning for the assault began in mid-May, with French advisors providing crucial intelligence about German defensive positions, trench systems, and the location of machine gun nests that had turned previous Allied attacks into bloodbaths. The Germans held Cantigny with elements of the 18th Army, seasoned troops who had fought on both the eastern and western fronts. They had transformed the village into a fortress, with concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and deep dugouts that could shelter men from even the heaviest artillery bombardment. American intelligence officers, working with French counterparts, estimated the German garrison at approximately 1,500 men, supported by artillery batteries positioned behind the ridge. The American plan was methodical, drawing on lessons learned from years of Allied failures. The attack would begin with a massive artillery preparation involving both American and French guns over 350 pieces ranging from 75mm field guns to enormous howitzers that could hurl shells weighing hundreds of pounds. 12 French tanks from the Groupement Estienne would provide mobile support, their steel hulls offering protection against machine gun fire as infantry advanced behind them. Air support would come from the 94th Aero Squadron, including pilots who would later become famous aces. But artillery and tanks meant nothing without infantry willing to close with the enemy and take ground. Meter by bloody meter. The 28th Infantry Regiment would lead the assault with 3 battalions attacking abreast, each assigned specific objectives within the village. The 1st Battalion, under Major Clarence Hubner, would strike the northern section, the 2nd Battalion, under Major George Rozelle, would hit the center, and the 3rd Battalion, under Major Theodore Lyman, would sweep the southern approaches. Supporting units would follow to consolidate gains and prepare for the inevitable German counterattacks. Training intensified in the final weeks before the assault. American soldiers practiced advancing behind rolling artillery barrages, learning to move forward in timed increments as shells landed just ahead of them. Terrifying but necessary technique that required absolute discipline and trust in the artillery crews. They rehearsed clearing trenches with bayonets and grenades, practiced coordinating with the French tanks, and memorized maps until every man knew exactly where he needed to be. The veterans of European warfare watched these preparations with interest, curious to see whether American enthusiasm could survive contact with German steel. French General Marie-Jeanne de Bigny, commanding the First Army in whose sector Cantigny lay, visited American positions on May 25th to inspect the troops and offer encouragement. Through an interpreter, he told assembled officers that the success of their attack would demonstrate to all of France that help had truly arrived from across the ocean. The pressure on these young Americans was immense. They were fighting not just for military objectives, but for their nation's honor and their allies' hopes. Colonel Ely told his men simply, "Take Cantigny and hold it." That is all. May 27th passed in tense anticipation, with artillery units moving into position under cover of darkness, while infantry companies made final preparations in their assembly trenches. Private First Class John Lewis Berkeley, sharpshooter from Missouri whose memoir No Hard Feelings would later provide one of the most vivid American accounts of the war, remembered the strange quiet that settled over the front that evening. "The Germans must have known something was coming," he wrote, "because their artillery was unusually active, throwing shells at random into our rear areas, trying to catch supply columns or troop movements." American chaplains moved through the trenches offering final prayers and words of comfort. Father Francis Patrick Duffy, the legendary chaplain of the 69th Infantry Regiment who was visiting the 1st Division, wrote in his diary that the men displayed a mixture of fear and determination that I have seen in soldiers throughout this terrible war, but with an added element of almost innocent confidence that seems uniquely American. Many soldiers wrote letters home, not knowing if they would survive to mail them. Others checked and rechecked their equipment trifles: bayonets, ammunition pouches, grenades, gas masks, water canteens. The modern soldier carried nearly 70 pounds of gear into battle. The night of May 27th to 28th was moonless and dark, which provided excellent cover for the final positioning of troops but also added to the tension and confusion. Companies moved forward in single file through communication trenches, navigating by whispered commands and the occasional shaded lantern. Officers synchronized their watches with artillery commanders, knowing that timing would be everything once the barrage began. The French tank crews ran final checks on their machines, mechanical beasts that fascinated the Americans who had never seen such weapons before. At exactly 4:45 in the morning on May 28th, the earth erupted. According to the official U.S. Army history compiled by the Historical Division of the Army War College, the artillery preparation transformed the German positions into a landscape of fire and smoke. With shells falling at a rate of several per second across the entire front, the sound was beyond description, a continuous roar that drowned out thought itself. In the trenches, American infantrymen pressed themselves against the forward walls, feeling the percussion of explosions through the ground, watching the horizon light up with orange and red flashes. For 1 hour, the bombardment continued with scientific precision. Forward observers adjusted fire, walking shells deeper into German positions to destroy artillery batteries and cut telephone lines. High explosive rounds demolished buildings and bunkers, while shrapnel shells burst above trenches to catch any defenders caught in the open. The 12 French tanks rumbled forward to their starting positions, their engines adding to the mechanical symphony of modern war. In the command post, Colonel Ely watched the clock, counting down the minutes until his infantry would go over the top. At 5:45, exactly 1 hour after the bombardment began. The artillery shifted to a rolling barrage that would advance 100 meters every 2 minutes. This was the signal. Officers blew their whistles, and 3,000 American infantrymen climbed out of their trenches into the smoky dawn. Private Berkeley recalled that his legs felt like lead, but he moved forward anyway, following the officer ahead of him, who walked calmly upright, despite the danger. The French tanks rolled ahead, their machine guns chattering. The battle for Cantigny had begun, and American soldiers were advancing into the unknown. The initial advance proceeded almost according to plan, which itself was remarkable given the chaos that typically characterized Great War offensives. American infantry moved forward in coordinated waves, maintaining formation despite the temptation to run or seek cover. The French tanks, though mechanically unreliable and painfully slow at just 2 miles per hour, provided psychological support as much as tactical advantage. Their presence gave the infantry confidence and drew German fire away from the vulnerable soldiers. Lieutenant Redwood later described the advance as walking into a storm of steel, with bullets cracking past our ears and shells exploding all around, yet somehow we kept moving forward. German defenders, stunned by the ferocity of the artillery preparation, initially offered limited resistance. Many had taken shelter in deep bunkers and emerged to find American soldiers already in their trenches. Close quarters fighting erupted throughout the ruined village, with Americans using rifles, bayonets, pistols, and grenades to clear buildings room by room. Sergeant First Class Samuel Woodfill, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for actions at another battle, was among those fighting through Cantigny's shattered streets. According to historical records maintained by the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, the savage nature of village fighting shocked even veterans' combat at ranges measured in feet rather than yards, with no quarter asked or given. The northern sector, assigned to Major Hubner's 1st Battalion, encountered the stiffest resistance around a fortified farmhouse that German machine gunners had converted into a strong point. 3 separate American assaults were thrown back with casualties before a French tank managed to position itself where its cannon could blast holes in the thick stone walls. When the 4th assault went in, led personally by Captain Clarence Oliver, the Americans overwhelmed the position in hand-to-hand combat. Oliver would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership that morning, one of dozens of decorations earned by 1st Division soldiers at Cantigny. By 7 in the morning, less than 90 minutes after the attack began, American troops had seized all their initial objectives. The village of Cantigny was in American hands, and engineers immediately began improving the defensive positions, knowing that German doctrine demanded immediate counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. The success stunned French observers who had expected the Americans to require multiple attempts over several days to take such a fortified position. General D'Aubigny sent his congratulations to division headquarters, noting that the American 1st Division has achieved in 2 hours what many veteran formations could not accomplish in days. But taking ground and holding it were 2 different propositions entirely. As the morning progressed and the smoke cleared, German artillery batteries that had survived the American bombardment began ranging in on Cantigny with devastating accuracy. Shells rained down on the captured village with mechanical regularity, turning buildings into death traps and making movement in daylight suicidal. Captain George Marshall, serving as operations officer for the 1st Division and destined to become one of America's greatest military leaders, coordinated the delivery of supplies and reinforcements under fire. Historical accounts compiled by Marshall's biographer, Forrest Pogue, describe the captain's calm efficiency even as shells exploded around division headquarters. The first German counterattack came at 9:30. Launched by fresh troops rushed forward from reserve positions. They advanced in dense formations supported by artillery and machine guns, attempting to overwhelm the American defenders through sheer numbers. Private Berkeley, positioned in a shell crater on the northern edge of the village with his Springfield rifle, remembered picking targets carefully as gray-clad German infantry came forward in waves. "We shot them down like we were at target practice," he wrote, "but they kept coming." American machine gunners, many operating weapons captured from the Germans, traversed their fire across the advancing formations, creating the same killing zones that Allied troops had faced for years. The German counterattacks continued throughout May 28th, with increasing ferocity, as commanders recognized that allowing the Americans to consolidate their position would represent both a tactical loss and a devastating blow to morale. Elements of 3 German divisions were thrown against Cantigny in waves that crashed against American defensive positions, like surf against rocks. Major General Robert Lee Bullard, commanding the 1st Division, later wrote in his memoir Personalities and Reminiscences of the War that the German determination to retake the village exceeded anything he had anticipated, turning what should have been a minor action into a battle of wills between 2 armies. American casualties mounted steadily as German artillery pounded the ruins of Cantigny without pause. The village that had stood for centuries was reduced to rubble, with only partial walls and cellars providing any shelter. Medical personnel worked frantically to evacuate wounded men to aid stations in the rear. But German shelling made even this dangerous work almost impossible during daylight hours. Stretcher bearers became targets, and the wounded often had to wait until darkness fell before they could receive proper treatment. Captain Clarence Hubner, whose battalion held the crucial northern sector, was wounded by shell fragments, but refused evacuation, remaining with his men throughout the battle. The French tanks that had supported the initial assault suffered heavily as well. Several broke down mechanically as the early tanks were notoriously unreliable, while others were knocked out by German artillery fire or fell into shell craters they could not escape. By midday on the 28th, only half the original 12 tanks remained operational, and even these had to withdraw periodically to refuel and rearm. Tank crews who survived the battle spoke with awe about American infantry, who continued fighting even after losing tank support, adapting quickly to circumstances that would have caused less determined troops to retreat. Communication proved challenging throughout the battle, as German artillery severed telephone lines almost as quickly as Signal Corps teams could repair them. Runners carrying messages between command posts and frontline units took terrible casualties, sprinting through shell fire to deliver information that might already be outdated by the time they arrived. Carrier pigeons provided some redundancy, and radio technology was beginning to emerge. But the primary means of command and control remained officers making decisions based on incomplete information and trusting their subordinates to execute those decisions. Lieutenant Colonel Conrad Babcock, commanding the 28th Infantry's 2nd Battalion, earned praise for his tactical flexibility in shifting reserves to threaten sectors based on fragmentary reports from forward observers. As afternoon turned to evening on May 28th, ammunition began running low in some sections of the American line. Supply parties attempting to move forward with fresh bullets and grenades were pinned down by artillery fire, forcing individual soldiers to scavenge ammunition from wounded comrades or captured German positions. Private Berkeley recalled having fewer than 20 rounds left for his rifle at one point, rationing each shot carefully until a supply detail finally reached his position after dark. Water became equally scarce, as shells had destroyed the village wells, and men were reduced to drinking from muddy shell craters or going thirsty. That night, under cover of darkness, both sides rushed reinforcements forward. The Germans brought up fresh battalions and additional artillery, determined to crush the American salient before it could be reinforced further. The Americans rotated exhausted companies out of the line and brought fresh troops forward. While engineers worked feverishly to improve trenches and dugouts, Colonel Ely visited frontline positions personally, offering encouragement to exhausted men who had been under fire for nearly 24 hours straight. According to accounts from soldiers who were there, his calm presence and confidence helped steady nerves that were beginning to fray under the constant stress of combat. May 29th dawned with German artillery resuming its merciless bombardment of American positions in Cantigny. And throughout the day, waves of German infantry launched desperate attempts to retake the village that had become a symbol of American military capability. The intensity of these attacks exceeded even the previous day's fighting, with German commanders throwing battalion after battalion against the American defenses in an attempt to overwhelm them through sheer persistence. Major Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., observing the battle from a nearby command post, wrote that the Germans seem absolutely determined to push us out, regardless of cost, as if the very honor of their army depended on it. The American defenders, now reinforced and resupplied, met each attack with rifle fire, machine guns, and grenades. Artillery support from French and American batteries provided crucial assistance, breaking up German formations before they could close with the American lines. Forward observers, often positioned in exposed locations where they could see the battlefield clearly, called down fire with precision that disrupted attack after attack. Captain Lloyd Ross, An artillery officer whose battery supported the 28th Infantry later described the battle as the most intensive fire mission I ever conducted, with shells leaving our guns in continuous succession for hours at a time. The strain on American troops was immense, as men who had already endured 2 days of combat now faced a third day of constant danger. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours, snatched in brief moments between attacks when exhaustion temporarily overcame fear. Food consisted of cold rations eaten while crouched in shell holes or ruins, as cooking fires were impossible under German observation. Officers watched their men carefully for signs of combat fatigue or shell shock, knowing that even the bravest soldier had limits to what he could endure. Company commanders reported that some men were so exhausted they fell asleep despite nearby shell explosions, their bodies simply shutting down from accumulated stress. German casualties during these counterattacks were staggering, with some attacking battalions losing more than half their strength in futile attempts to break through American lines. This information comes from German regimental histories examined by American military historians after the war, including research conducted by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. The German commanders' determination to erase this American victory led them to feed troops into a meat grinder, replicating the same tragic mistakes that had characterized so much of the war. American soldiers, firing at close range against massed formations, inflicted casualties at a rate that shocked even hardened observers. By the afternoon of May 29th, the German attacks began to lose momentum as commanders recognized that the cost of continuing the assault exceeded any tactical advantage they might gain from recapturing Cantigny. French intelligence reports indicated that German units were being pulled back to rest and refit, replaced by troops assigned to static defensive duties rather than offensive operations. This shift suggested that the Germans had accepted American possession of Cantigny as a fait accompli, at least for the moment. Major General Bullard, receiving these reports at division headquarters, allowed himself cautious optimism that the worst had passed. The final German attack came at dusk on May 29th, a half-hearted probe that was repulsed easily by American defenders who were beginning to feel confident in their positions. As darkness fell and no further attacks materialized, soldiers began to realize they had taken territory from the German army and kept it. Against everything the enemy could throw at them, Lieutenant Redwood, whose diary provides valuable perspective on the common soldier's experience, wrote that night, "We are still here. We have proven ourselves. Whatever happens in this war from now on, no one can say the Americans cannot fight." By May 31st, relative quiet had settled over Cantigny as both sides shifted to defensive postures, consolidating positions and recovering from the brutal 3-day battle. American troops began the grim work of burying the dead, clearing debris, and improving their defensive positions for what they assumed would be a long occupation of this strategically insignificant but symbolically crucial piece of French countryside. Casualty reports filtering back to division headquarters revealed the price paid for this first American victory. Approximately 1,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing from the 1st Division, with German losses estimated at several times that number based on prisoner interrogations and observed casualties. The strategic impact of Cantigny was minimal. The village sat on a small ridge overlooking farmland, and its capture did not significantly alter the overall military situation in France. But the symbolic and psychological impact reverberated far beyond the battlefield itself. General Pershing immediately recognized the battle's importance for American morale and prestige, issuing a congratulatory order to the 1st Division that was read to every unit in the American Expeditionary Forces. His message was simple but powerful. The 1st Division has shown that American soldiers can fight and win in modern warfare. You have earned the respect of your allies and the fear of your enemies. French and British reactions to the American success at Cantigny were overwhelmingly positive, tinged with relief that the untested Americans had not embarrassed themselves or their allies. General D'Aubigny sent an official commendation to General Bullard, praising the courage, determination, and tactical skill displayed by American troops. British newspapers, previously skeptical about American military capabilities, published favorable accounts of the battle. The Times of London, in an editorial that was widely reprinted in American newspapers, wrote that the sons of those who fought at Lexington and Gettysburg have proven themselves worthy descendants, standing firm in the face of the most modern horrors of warfare. Back in the United States, news of the victory at Cantigny dominated headlines and provided a much-needed boost to public morale, at a time when casualty lists from other Allied offensives painted a grim picture of modern war. The New York Times ran a front-page story on June 1st under the headline, "Americans Take and Hold Cantigny." With detailed accounts of the battle based on official Army reports and journalist dispatches, editorial writers across the country seized on the victory as validation of America's decision to enter the war, arguing that American soldiers were making a real difference in the struggle against German militarism. Individual acts of heroism at Cantigny began receiving recognition as commanders submitted recommendations for decorations. Private First Class Berkeley, whose marksmanship had broken up several German attacks, was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Captain Oliver, who had led the assault on the fortified farmhouse, received his decoration personally from General Pershing. Dozens of silver stars were awarded to soldiers who had displayed exceptional courage under fire. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, was not awarded for actions at Cantigny itself, though several men who fought there would earn it in subsequent battles. French civilians in the region, who had endured for years of German occupation and military operations in their countryside, welcomed the Americans as liberators, even though Cantigny itself was so thoroughly destroyed that civilian habitation was impossible for months afterward. Elderly farmers who had watched armies march back and forth across their land told American soldiers that they reminded them of French troops in the early days of the war, enthusiastic, confident, not yet ground down by years of futility and loss. These conversations, recorded in letters and diaries, reminded Americans of why they were fighting, to help free people who had suffered terribly under the weight of a war they had not chosen. The lessons learned at Cantigny influenced American tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. The success of the carefully planned artillery preparation, the coordination between infantry and the few available tanks, and the importance of immediate defensive consolidation after taking an objective all became standard elements of American operations. More importantly, the battle gave American soldiers confidence in themselves and their leaders, proving that with proper preparation and determination, they could succeed against a veteran enemy on even terms. The Battle of Cantigny occurred at a crucial moment in the Great War's final year, when the outcome hung in delicate balance between Allied exhaustion and German desperation. Throughout the spring of 1918, the German army had launched a series of massive offensives, collectively known as the Kaiserschlacht, or Kaiser's Battle, that pushed Allied forces back across much of the ground, gained at terrible cost in previous years. The German spring offensive began on March 21st and achieved initial success that brought German troops closer to Paris than they had been since 1914. French and British forces bled white by years of attrition, desperately needed reinforcement. Into this crisis stepped the American Expeditionary Forces, but questions remained about their combat effectiveness. European military professionals, steeped in the hard lessons of modern warfare, worried that American enthusiasm would prove no match for German tactical skill and artillery. The French had proposed integrating American units directly into French divisions as replacements, a plan that would have given Americans combat experience, but denied them the opportunity to fight as a distinct national army. General Pershing's insistence on American forces fighting under American command had created tension with Allied leaders who valued manpower over national pride. Cantigny provided the answer to these questions and validated Pershing's strategy. According to military historian John Eisenhower in his book, Yanks: The Epic Story of the American Army in World War I, the battle demonstrated that American forces, when properly trained and led, could execute complex operations successfully and hold ground against determined counterattacks. This assessment was shared by military observers from multiple nations who had watched the battle unfold. The American ability to coordinate infantry, artillery, and armor in a combined arms assault showed tactical sophistication that many Europeans had not expected from such a new military force. The German army, for its part, took notice of this new adversary. German intelligence reports from late May and early June 1918, captured after the war and examined by historians, reveal concern about American fighting qualities observed at Cantigny. While German commanders remained confident in their tactical superiority, they recognized that American entry into the war had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The seemingly unlimited American manpower and industrial resources meant that time now favored the Allies, and every week that passed saw more American divisions arriving in France. The battle's timing proved fortuitous for Allied morale. Just days after Cantigny, German forces launched another major offensive at Château-Thierry, threatening Paris directly and creating a crisis that required immediate American intervention. The 2nd and 3rd American divisions were rushed into the line, helping to stop the German advance at Belleau Wood and Château-Thierry in battles that would become legendary in U.S. Marine Corps and Army history. But these later battles might have unfolded differently if Cantigny had failed Allied. Commanders might have been less willing to trust American units with critical sectors, and American soldiers themselves might have approached combat with less confidence. For the soldiers who fought at Cantigny, the battle became a defining moment that shaped how they understood themselves and their role in the war. Officers who led companies and platoons at Cantigny would go on to command battalions and regiments in later battles. Enlisted men who survived the German counterattacks gained confidence in their own abilities and their fellow soldiers. The 1st Division, having earned its nickname the Big Red One through this baptism of fire, would go on to fight in every major American engagement of the war, always carrying the distinction of being the first to prove American combat capability. The battle also influenced American military culture in ways that persisted long after the war ended. The emphasis on careful preparation combined with aggressive execution, the willingness to accept casualties to achieve objectives, and the determination to hold ground once taken all became hallmarks of the American military tradition. Cantigny demonstrated that American democratic society, often dismissed by European militarists as too soft for modern war, could produce soldiers equal to any in the world when national survival demanded it. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments lay individual human stories of courage, fear, sacrifice, and survival that gave the Battle of Cantigny its true meaning. 20-year-old Private Harold Pierce from Indiana, serving with Company B of the 28th Infantry Regiment, wrote a letter to his parents 3 days after the battle describing his experiences in terms that captured the confusion and terror of modern combat. Mother and father, I cannot adequately describe what we went through. The noise alone was enough to drive a man mad, and yet we kept going forward because the fellows on either side of us were going forward too. Captain Clarence Oliver, whose leadership at the fortified farmhouse earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, was a pre-war regular Army officer who had joined the service to escape poverty in rural Alabama. His letters to his wife, preserved in the National Archives, reveal a thoughtful man who understood the historical significance of what his unit had accomplished. "We have written a new chapter in American military history," he wrote on June 2nd. "Whatever else happens in this war, historians will remember that on May 28, 1918, American soldiers took German-held territory and held it against everything they threw at us." Not all stories ended in triumph. Lieutenant James Wilson, leading a platoon in Major Russell's 2nd Battalion, was killed by artillery fire on the 2nd day of battle while organizing his men to repel a German counterattack. His death, one of approximately 200 Americans killed at Cantigny, left his young widow back in Ohio to raise their infant son alone. She would receive a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Babcock describing her husband's bravery and the successful repulse of the attack he had died defending against, but such official condolences provided cold comfort to those who mourned. Medical personnel faced their own particular horrors during and after the battle. Captain Lawrence Kilburn, a physician from Massachusetts serving as battalion surgeon with the 28th Infantry, worked for 72 hours straight treating wounded men in an aid station that was itself under periodic shell fire. In his memoir, published privately after the war, he described the ethical agony of triage, deciding which wounded men would receive immediate treatment and which would have to wait, knowing that some of those forced to wait would not survive. "I became a doctor to save lives," he wrote, "but war forces you to make decisions no human should have to make." The French civilians, whose village had become a battlefield, paid their own price. Cantigny's pre-war population of fewer than 100 residents had been evacuated when German forces first occupied the region in 1914. When American engineers began clearing the ruins after the battle, they discovered that almost nothing remained of the medieval church. The stone houses where families had lived for generations, or the small shops that had served the community. One elderly resident, escorted to view the ruins by French officials in June, reportedly stood silently surveying the destruction before saying simply, "C'est la guerre," This is war. German soldiers who fought at Cantigny also had their stories, though these have received less attention in American historical accounts. Interrogation of prisoners captured during the battle revealed that many were 18 or 19 years old. Conscripted from farms and small towns across Bavaria and Prussia, one prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Franz Müller, who spoke some English, told his captors that German soldiers had been assured the Americans were poorly trained and would break easily under pressure. "We were told you would run at the first counterattack," he reportedly said. "But you did not run. You fought like demons." His words, recorded in intelligence reports, inadvertently paid tribute to the very men who had captured him. The Battle of Cantigny concluded on May 31, 1918, when German forces definitively abandoned efforts to retake the village. But its influence on American military history extended far beyond those 3 days of combat in the spring of the war's final year. The 1st Division remained in the Cantigny sector for several more weeks before being relieved and moved to other sectors, where American forces were being concentrated for larger operations. The village itself, thoroughly destroyed, would not be rebuilt in its original location. Post-war reconstruction placed the new Cantigny slightly to the west of the battlefield, leaving the original site as a memorial to the violence that had occurred there. General Pershing, recognizing the battle's symbolic importance, ensured that Cantigny received prominent mention in his final report to the Secretary of War. He wrote that the action proved the fighting quality of American soldiers and justified the faith placed in them by the American people and their government. This official recognition helped cement Cantigny's place in American military tradition, making it the subject of countless histories, memoirs, and eventually textbooks that introduced generations of American students to the Great War. The battle became shorthand for American arrival as a military power, the moment when the United States took its place among the world's martial nations. The 1st Division, bloodied at Cantigny, went on to participate in every major American battle of the remaining war months. They fought in the Anmarn Offensive, the St. Mihiel Offensive, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest battle in American military history. In each engagement, the division performed with distinction, building on the confidence and tactical lessons gained at Cantigny. By war's end in November 1918, the Big Red One had suffered over 23,000 casualties, but had established a combat record that made it one of the most decorated divisions in the American Expeditionary Forces. The tactical lessons of Cantigny influenced American military doctrine well into the 20th century: the importance of thorough reconnaissance and planning, the value of combined arms operations integrating infantry, artillery, and armor, and the necessity of preparing for counterattacks after taking an objective, all became standard elements of American tactical training. Officers who fought at Cantigny, including George Marshall, who would become Army Chief of Staff during World War II, carried these lessons forward into the next generation of military leadership. Marshall himself often cited Cantigny as an example of successful combined arms warfare in lectures at the Army War College during the interwar years. The human cost of the battle remained with survivors throughout their lives. Veterans of the 1st Division formed associations and held reunions where aging men gathered to remember comrades lost in French mud and to celebrate their shared accomplishment. The 1st Division Association, established after the war, became one of the most active veterans organizations in the United States, preserving records and memories that might otherwise have been lost. Their efforts ensured that the sacrifices made at Cantigny would not be forgotten, even as public attention turned to other wars and other battles. In France, the battlefield at Cantigny became a site of remembrance and reconciliation. American and French veterans returned in the 1920s and 30s to dedicate memorials and visit the ground where they had fought. A monument erected in 1937 bears inscriptions in both English and French, honoring the soldiers who fought there and the civilians whose village was destroyed. The monument stands today as a testament to the brief but intense battle that introduced American military power to the Western Front and changed the course of the Great War's final months. The strategic impact of Cantigny on the war's outcome was modest. One village taken and held did not alter the military balance significantly. But battles are fought in the minds and hearts of soldiers as much as on physical terrain, and Cantigny's psychological impact was profound. It gave American troops confidence in themselves and their leaders at precisely the moment when Allied forces needed reinforcement most desperately. It demonstrated to German commanders that they now faced a new enemy who could not be easily dismissed or defeated. And it showed the world that the United States, having entered the war reluctantly in 1917, possessed the will and capability to see it through to victory. Barclay, who survived the war and lived into the 1960s, told interviewers that nothing in his long life compared to the 3 days when he and his comrades held that shattered French village against everything the German army could throw at them. "We were just farm boys and city kids," he said in a 1962 interview, "but for those 3 days, we were the equal of any soldiers who ever lived. We proved that Americans could fight, and we did it in a place most people had never heard of and can't pronounce. But we knew. We were there. We held." The Battle of Cantigny thus earned its place in history not through strategic brilliance or tactical innovation, but through the simple fact that American soldiers, tested for the first time in modern industrial warfare, stood firm and accomplished their mission. They earned respect on foreign soil through blood, courage, and determination, proving that the new world could produce soldiers equal to the old. In doing so, they began the transformation of the United States from a regional power into the military force that would help decide 2 world wars and shape the remainder of the 20th century. The village of Cantigny, destroyed and rebuilt, stands today as a quiet reminder of the day when American troops first proved themselves in the crucible of the Western Front and earned their place in military history.